Marshall Mathers IV here. I wish Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, which came out and was released on May 16 in the year 2002, being exactly 3 years after Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, came out, which was in 1999, May of 1999 to be exact. I personally and strongly wish and think that Star Wars Attack of the Clones, or Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, in the Star Wars prequel trilogy should have in fact came out and been released on May 16 in the year 2001, which would have only then been 2 years after Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, came out and was released. And that's as long of a wait as the people should have had to wait for a sequel to Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And just as Anakin should have in fact been played by Hayden Christensen from the very start and beginning of the Star Wars prequel trilogy, so that both Anakin and Padme would have both been 14 years old, I would have wanted the events of Star Wars Attack of the Clones, or Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, the events of the movie to take place also only 2 years after Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And also, George Lucas, if anything, should not have been in charge of writing and making a script. He should have hired much better and greater writers than himself to make a great script, instead of the cringy, stupid, ridiculous shit that we actually and unfortunately got instead. All because the script of Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, just like Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, was written by George Lucas. And of course, same with Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. And I mean, the thing is, George Lucas was not in charge of writing a script for the original Star Wars films. At least I don't think he was, and that's why they were so great. They actually had a good story and script, both. George Lucas mainly just focused on directing and probably the special effects and whatnot. And that's the only thing he also should have focused on in the prequel Star Wars trilogy as well. And another thing that I definitely think should have been different about Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones is the fact that Darth Maul should have returned and would have had a good reason to come back, to have revenge on Obi-Wan. And how awesome would that have been if we would have gotten, I don't know, some conflict between Darth Maul, who would have, if anything, had cyborg legs because Obi-Wan cut him in half in the previous film, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and then obviously Darth Maul would be just so bent on getting revenge and just waiting on having his revenge on Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then also, I think that there should have been other villains in Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones that there weren't, such as General Grievous. I think that would have also been awesome to have both General Grievous and Darth Maul in Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, as well as Count Dooku, as he actually was, and of course Jango Fett. And one other thing, and probably the last thing, if anything, that I most definitely wish about Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, well, I guess a couple things, is one, that Anakin and Padme's characters would have, of course, been 16 if the events of Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones only had taken place 2 years after the events of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and if Hayden Christensen would have played Anakin from the very start and beginning of the prequel trilogy, and been the same age as Padme, they would have been 14 in the first film, 16 in the second, and then in the third film would have been the biggest time gap between Star Wars Attack of the Clones and Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, being exactly 5-year gap between those films, so that Anakin and Padme in Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith would have been 22 years old. And the very last thing I strongly wish would have been different about Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones is the fact that I personally wish and would have preferred Jango Fett to have gotten more lines and more screen time, which he obviously didn't. Kind of like in the same way that Darth Maul barely had any lines at all, or any screen time at all for that matter, in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And in the same way, Jango Fett barely had any lines or screen time in Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. And like Darth Maul, Jango Fett was a pretty awesome villain, in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure in the opinions of other people as well. And it's also too bad that Jango Fett is only in one of the Star Wars movies in the Star Wars prequel trilogy. And the only movie he's in, he dies in. But in the original Star Wars trilogy, Boba Fett, his son, was in pretty much all 3 films in the original Star Wars trilogy. But Jango Fett was only in 1, which honestly I think sucks. And I wish they could have made that in a way similar. Maybe have Jango Fett, I don't know, die in Revenge of the Sith instead of Attack of the Clones. But if he was meant to die in Attack of the Clones, then I at least wish he would have had more screen time and more lines. And of course that Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, should have came out and been released on May 16 in the year 2001.